A History of Ancient Egypt from the First Farmers to the Great Pyramid. Part 1. Making Culture. 5000 to 3000 BC. 1. Beside the Pale Lake. Living in the Faiyum, circa 5000 to 4000 BC. It was wetter then than it is now. Though the monsoons were slowly failing, the plains were grass-green and scented with flowering shrubs, whilst the valleys held exotic trees, such as still grow in Central Africa. To the east of the Saharan plateau, small groups of hunters camped occasionally inside the sheltered wadis that ran down into the Nile Valley, and they took fish from the river, hare, gazelle, and wild cattle from the fringes of the plain above, and gathered seeds and tubers from the rushy swamps that lay along the river's edge. In the slow flow of prehistory, the changes that were transforming the Saharan plains into a hot sand sea would have been imperceptible, even to hunters living off the land. Then, suddenly, some 7,000 years ago, a new way of living was introduced into this gentle Eden. For modern archaeologists, the revolution takes the shape of storage bins. 300 of them, set in the crusted surface of a desert and tokening the rival in the land of Egypt of the single greatest transformation the human race has ever undertaken, the change from hunting and gathering to husbandry and farming. Before there was farming, the inhabitants of Egypt had lived peripatetic lives, collecting the natural resources of the land according to the seasons of the year. These storage bins, however, groups of circular pits set beside the hearthstones of small settlements, were made by people who planted grain and later on had harvested the crop, and who therefore had lived in the same place for a great part of the year. The consequences of this change were literally monumental. Within 1,500 years, the descendants of those first Egyptian farmers were building pyramids for Pharaoh. It is not surprising, then, that to modern minds the story of those 15 prehistoric centuries promises a unique history. When they were newly made, each one of those first known grain bins could have held 800 weight of cereals, mixes mostly of wild seed, emmer, wheat, and 2 and 6 row barley, crops that with a low yield would have required 2 to 3 acres of land to fill a single bin. Planted in October and November and ripened during the following months of growth and maturation. The contents of one such grain bin would have taken the farmers several days to harvest, and would have needed further labor afterwards to process the seed for eating. In the 1920s, when the grain bins were first excavated, one of them still held a farmer's sickle, a little tree branch nicely shaped into a wooden stick, with a row of notched flint blades set end to end along one side of it to form a single cutting edge. There were, as well, some 7 pounds of harvested seed, golden, dry and so perfectly preserved that a museum curator once tried, unsuccessfully, to germinate some of them. They are the oldest known examples of Egyptian grain, that bounty which, millennia later, the book of Genesis would describe as being without number, as the sand of the sea. Here, then, the inhabitants of the lower Nile had settled down, seeded the silty soil, and begun to count out their years and harvests, which in later centuries became so generous as to enable the building of the pyramids, and finally, at ancient Egypt's ending, to supply the bread to feed Caesar's Rome. 4 feet across and half as deep, Egypt's first known grain bins were mud-plastered pits lined with rush-woven baskets that, after they had been filled with seed, were sealed with a strong flat lid made from a mix of salt and sand, woven from their center in a coil. Some of these hefty grain baskets are of the same construction as Egyptian village baskets of today and, indeed, as those used by Pharaoh's workmen. Similar storage facilities were also used until quite recently by the Molite people of West Africa, who stored and traded their annual harvests according to their need. If the grain was well treated, they told a visiting anthropologist in the 1970s, if it were kept dry and stirred occasionally, the seeds would live within their bins for a full 3 years. Elaborated and enlarged Pharaoh's seed stores, ancient Egypt's real gold, would feed priests, courtiers, and craftsmen, but forbade harvests and fueled the ambitions of the master builders. Egypt's first known grain stores, however, are not in the valley of the Nile, but in a mysterious depression in the Sahara that then, as now, held a lake fed by a meandering branch of the river Nile, lying on the west side of the river some 40 miles south of modern Cairo and known today as Lake Faiyum. The ancient lake was annually revived by fierce flood waters from the nearby river that pushed their way through a narrow breach in the valley's western cliffs and flowed into the lowlying plain of the Faiyum Depression. That same vast flood gave life to the entirety of Egypt, swelling once a year to 12 to 14 times higher than its usual flow. Its waters flooded the best part of the Nile Valley through all of ancient history and, indeed, until the last 2 centuries in the building of a series of retaining dams. There was no other water source in all of Egypt, no rain in the last 5,000 years sufficient to sustain a single plant, nothing other than this single river. All life flowed from the Nile and the rich organic soil that carried in its annual flooding, the product of seasonal and heavy rains in the highlands of Ethiopia, and the days of the Fayyum. Farmers, as in the slightly drier times of Pharaoh's Egypt, more than 100 million tons of sediment came down the river in an average flood. This then refertilized the narrow silty plains within the Nile Valley, the marshlands and the water meadows of the river's delta, and the lake and fens of the Fayyum. At the time that the lake dwellers were laying down their grain storage bins, the annual floods were generous, the shallow lake some 50 miles wide. Today, the lake is but a ghostly mirage a quarter of that size, so that the sandy banks on which the ancient farmers set their grain bins stand high and dry, a thin light line on the horizon of a pale desert. So when you stand upon that ancient lakeshore, with your back turned on the salt-encrusted mirage of the modern lake, you may still see the outlines of some of these momentous grain bins or, at least, the slight indentations of their excavation, running across a 10-foot bank above the ancient shoreline, spotted now with dusty shrubs. Once, though, thick grass and rushes had grown along this bleached-out beach, traces of their desiccated roots still snaked through the ancient bone-dry silt, and nearby, there had been a pair of marshy ponds, where fishing was convenient and plentiful. The community that gathered Egypt's first known harvest seems to have lived next to their grain stores, up on the same bankside. The absence of ruined walls, however, or even of post holes that could have supported roofing beams or tents, suggests that they moved as lightly on the earth as had their hunter-gatherer predecessors. Nor has a single grave of these first farmers been uncovered. Yet traces of their hearths remain. At some of the smaller settlements, summer storms have washed their ashes down into the now vanished lake, leaving dark streaks on the surface of the ancient desert. Close to the grain bins, too, the farmers' hearths were found intact, some with cooking pots still standing at their centers with fish and animal bones within them and charcoal banked up all around. Ashes from these hearths provide a date for some of these fires at around 4300 BC, whilst other excavations at the ancient lake show that, by that time, similar communities had inhabited the area for the best part of 1,000 years. All of these sometime farmers had built similarly simple shelters from animal hides in the lakeside reeds and rushes, which they had also used to weave the linings of their storage bins. The largest known of all the lakeside settlements, some 50 yards in length and width, are those beside the grain bins. Archaeologists have distinguished at least 3 different periods of occupation within these settlements, each of which had flourished for considerable periods of time, one following another. So, despite the 300 grain bins, we may imagine that, at any one time, such communities were no larger than a few family groups. All these lakeside farmers appeared to have processed their crops in the same way, threshing their grain with sticks and pounding some of the harder seeds with hammer stones to split them open, then scooping up the kernels with shells and little finely woven baskets before grinding the corn to flour between 2 heavy stones. The hardness of some of the different grain stalks appears to have been an especial problem. Quantities of burnt corn mixed with charcoal found in One of the grain bins may have been a discarded byproduct of parching, which aimed to burst the seed like popcorn, a process that may have taken place at harvest time by simply setting fire to the dry plants in the fields. A more agreeable explanation, however, is that this spoiled grain was not the byproduct of careless parching, but of malting and of making beer. Although there is no direct evidence of brewing in these earliest of settlements, beer would become a staple commodity in the diet of various prehistoric Nile-side farming communities. As well as cultivating grain, the Faiyum farmers reared animals. Large quantities of cattle, goat and, above all, sheep bones lay strewn throughout the settlements, whilst others were found in stewing pots still resting on the hearths. Nothing is known about the conditions in which these flocks were kept. What is clear, however, is that some of the hard wild seeds the farmers had stored in certain of their grain bins may have been especially gathered to support their flocks during the Egyptian summers, when there was little for such domesticated animals to forage. In wintertime, however, they could well have grazed alongside the wild gazelle and hartebeest that came down to the lakeside, and these too, so the bones within the settlements still tell, the farmers also caught and cooked. For these farmers were still hunters, and although the pig bones found within the settlements could have been those of either domesticated animals or wild boar, the remains of turtle shells, crocodile scales and the butchered bones of hippopotami, as well as those of bittern and geese which fed in the warm shallows of the Faiyum lakeside, show that they still had the Catholic palate of hunter-gatherers. And the farmers still fished and hunted in the age-old ways as well, with nets and flint-tipped arrows, harpoons and spears. Lake fish were a year-round staple. Above all others, the farmers ate the Nile catfish, a small-eyed, flat-headed, bewhiskered monster who grew to an enormous size and to whom later Nile fishermen attributed legendary powers of survival in the drying summer mud. To catch such fearsome beasts, the farmers made harpoons barbed and tipped with animal bone and ivory. These were the elegant ancestors of a millennial tradition in which the harpoon would become a chosen weapon in the internecine battles between the pharaonic Egyptian gods. Enormous fish bones from the settlement show that the farmers also caught some of the big old fish which lived in the deepest sections of the lake. And this, in turn, tells that they were also expert boatmen, constructing their craft in all probability from bunches of the same reeds and rushes which they use for their grain bins in their shelters. Such expertise was part of a millennial inheritance. Similarly sized fish bones, gathered from the hearts of some of the hunter-gatherers who had camped beside the Nile for millennia before the farmers had come to live beside the lake, show that they were also taking huge fish from the center of the river and that their boats must therefore have been capable of handling fish some 6 to 8 feet long. Marks on some of the fish bones left by these ancient hunter-gatherers, however, appear to show that, unlike the Faiyum farmers, they had filleted and smoked their catch. Yet fish stewed upon the farmers' hearths would also have obtained a distinctive smoky taste. For the farmers made their cooking pots from clay made from river silt, and even though they part covered the interior of some of them with red slip, and brusquely burnished them as well, which would have rendered them less porous, the modest, low-fired wares would not have stopped the distinctive taste of wood ash and smoke from the fire beneath permeating everything that was cooked within them. The faintest traces of the activities of hunting and of modest hearths set right on the ancient lakeside beaches show that, as well as cooking on the well-established hearths within their settlements, the farmers also built small seasonal encampments and held summer barbecues in them, just as the hunter-gatherers had done before them. Now though, and for the first time in Egypt, daily life was driven by the various activities of farming. The Nile Year. Pollen caught in the fibers of the Faiyum grain bins shows that they had been woven in the weeks before the annual grain harvest, and that their makers had twisted and tied the coils of Russian grasses that had been gathered from the drying swamps beside the lake, in late March or in early April. This was the start of summer, a time of darkening skies and violent storms. of sweeping winds and gusts of hot dry air. It was also the last month in which wild honey could be taken from the hive, a time when the meadows began to desiccate, when fish swam ever closer in the wetland shrinking pools until they turned into a single thrashing mass which could be harvested by hand. And that farmers stewed this glittering annual bounty is witnessed by the considerable quantities of small and spiky fish bones which the archaeologists found lying in their cooking pots. Egypt is traditionally reckoned to have but 3 seasons, a lengthy summer, followed by 2 months of an autumn inundation, and then a fruitful winter, when cereals were grown. Summer was the worst of times, and though it rained a little more in the times of the Faiyum farmers than it would throughout the following millennia, the difference would have been slight. Many of the native birds flew northwards out of Egypt at that time to avoid the growing heat. Plants and fruits all but disappeared, and the wild melons which grew in the lakeside gullies became so dry that the winds rattled the seeds within the gourds. Even the wild roots that were a perennial food source of the Faiyum farmers would become so hard within the great cracked earth they would have had to be ground to flour and soaked in water before they could be eaten. Then, in June, in the sun's full heat, the Nile became turbid and turned slightly sour, an augur of the coming flood, and slowly it began to rise. In July, with the river's stream flowing ever swifter, ever higher, sunset winds blew cool and fresh above the stream. And then in August, when the flood was imminent, and temperatures stood well above 40 degrees Celsius, the universe appeared to pause. Hardships of biblical dimensions threatened if the flood was overgenerous, and drowned the marshes and the meadows for too long a time. For then the flood would be late in receding, the standing waters would delay the farmers sowing, and damp and fungus would menace the seed stores, and frogs and rodents would come to plague the settlements. When they were first excavated in the 1920s, some of the Faiyum grain bins held the frail corpses of whole families of mice, snuggled between the baskets and the lining clay. And lean years, on the other hand, when the flood was low, its waters may not have even breached the narrow gap within the valley cliffs that fed the Faiyum lake. All ancient life within the orbit of the river Nile, the most placid, regular and majestic of the world's great rivers, depended on the volume of this annual watering. Even a modest difference in the height of the inundation, a slight change in the snow melt in the Ethiopian mountains or in the quantity of monsoon rains in Central Africa, could impoverish or enrich all life within the river's orbit. For the early farmers by the Faiyum Lake, a 5-foot flood over the water meadows would have been prodigal and destructive, while a 3-foot flood would have been insufficient to cover the arable land and threaten not only the size of the next harvest but the formation of salt and white crusts across the surface of the drying silt, rendering it infertile. And lean times too, the 500-odd square miles of the surface of the shallow lake would continue to evaporate and shrink around the year, along with the stored resources of the farmers whose livelihood depended on it. The perfect flood, on the other hand, burst the river's banks in late August, carrying fresh, clear, fertile silt and washing away the salt that had crystallized upon the drying mud throughout the baking months of summer. All that, and the sudden bounty, when there was little else to eat, of spawning catfish in the muddy water, which were then so lazy that the normally aggressive beasts could be lifted by a pair of skillful hands. In September, when the flood lay still and shiny right across the valley of the Nile and the Faiyum Lake was twice the size of that of Galilee, there would be dew again, in dappled clouds in the bright blue sky. Then in October, when the floodwaters were starting to recede and the mornings were becoming cool and misty, sowing could have started. In later ages, Nile farmers tended to sow their muddy meadows in December and January, when the scorpions and snakes were hibernating and the evenings were occasionally cool enough to spin a gossamer of frost. By that time, though, the first Faiyum farmers appear to have left their fields behind them, for analyses of the pollen from their settlements show that they were absent for a great part of winter. It may be, then, that these first farmers shared some of the ancient habits of the hunter-gatherers who appeared to have left the Nile Valley in the months following the flood, to travel east, up, through the mountain valleys to the beaches of the Red Sea, or perhaps westward, across the dry savanna to the exotic oases of the Sahara, before returning to the valley of the Nile in summertime. There is no firm evidence, however, that the Faiyum farmers went on such a trek, no evidence whatever of their existence other than that found beside the lake. Nor is this surprising, for few traces of ancient life within the Nile Valley have survived, moving erratically within the narrow confines of its cliff-lined valley. The river's course has slowly migrated from west to east over the millennia, so that the great part of the remains of its past inhabitants and visitors have been washed away or are still deeply buried in the river's silt. Only the tombs and temples built along the edges of the ancient floodplain remain, along with the graves set down in the dry sands around the valley's cliffs. That no graves or cemeteries have yet been found beside the farmers' sandy settlements round Lake Faiyum, however, may be a further indication, together with the absence of winter pollens, that the farming revolution had not entirely changed these people's lives, that when the flood subsided and they had done their sowing, the farmers went traveling again, with their children, their animals and their dogs. Whatever their peregrinations, by February the higher rising sun was breaking the cold, the Nile was running clear and sweet again, and the crops that the farmers sowed in early winter were reaching their full height. And so, by March or early April, when their cereals were ripe for harvesting, the farmers would have walked back to their shining lake, for this was the climax of their agricultural year, the time of weaving grain bins once again, and filling them with seed. Measured lives. These then, were newly situated people leading newly measured lives. Though the hunter-gatherers had also lived in concert with the seasons, an endless round of travel prompted by the rhythms of the year, the Faiyum farmers now lived the best part of the year within a single landscape with their animals and fields and food stores. So though their lives were still marked and measured by the seasons, they were set upon another treadmill. And it was this that brought about a fundamental change in human sensibility. Even their pottery was different. Though the farmers still made little bowls off clay as the hunter-gatherers had done, each one pinched out of a bowl of the grayish Nile mud and sized, appropriately, to fit into a hand. The farmers also made tiny little cups that were whimsically supported on 4 small feet, as well as a variety of rough rectangular dishes, similar to the trays employed by later cultures to bake flat bread made from ground corn upon an open hearth. Now, too, the farmers made much larger pots as well, gently rounding their bases so as to allow them to stand upright in the ashes of their cooking fires. Bell-mouthed, stout and square of profile, these domestic wares were large and strong enough to have also served as water storage vessels, or indeed as little ovens in which the gathered grain could have been parched or malted. Clearly, hunter-gatherers would have had but little use for such elaborations. Their pottery did not have to serve nearly as many functions, nor had it been made with care to last. This, then, was the difference. Moving continuously through a variety of landscapes all around the year, hunter-gatherers were themselves part of the natural processes which they exploited. There was no need for them to view their small communities as separate from nature. Such self-consciousness indeed might have threatened their existence. The farmers, on the other hand, lived in the same place for the best part of the year and were set into a fixed pattern of activities, a pattern that, for part of the year at least, did not immediately provide their daily diet. This, then, was a life requiring forward planning, a life requiring a certain distance from the immediate environment, a certain objectivity. In no way does this imply that the Faiyum farmers engaged in abstract dialogues about the nature of their lives that can now be reconstructed under such headings as economic necessity or man's natural nature. That would require the unwarranted assumption that these farmers acted on reflection and opinion, just as, we imagine, we do today. Nor is there any need for such suspect reconstructions of the prehistoric mind when there are clear contemporary expressions of the Faiyum farmers' newfound objectivity within the very things they made. Just as the routine of farming had patterned and reframed the landscape in which they lived, so too the things the farmers used and made were part and product of those same activities. Though coarse and workmanlike, the farmers' grain baskets, for example, are expertly woven in a variety of rhythmic patterns whose regularity is emphasized by their weavers' careful choice of equally sized stems of cane and rush. In similar fashion, the fine domestic baskets, which are woven from materials just half as thick as those used by the grain basket weavers, hold an equal delight in scale and pattern, and they have patterns, too, made from the different colored stems of straw that the weavers chose. The quality such things display, their forms and patterning, are illustrations of the order that the first farmers were imposing on the landscapes and routines of their lives. Nothing better exemplifies this newly developing sense of order than the scraps of linen that have been found within the Faiyum farmers' settlements. In their order and abstraction and in the precision of their planning, the tiny fragments contain the measured pattern of life in the communities which made them. Such work takes a variety of special skills, and time and planning too. In all probability, the blue-flowered flax from which these cloths were woven also grew beside the lake. Such plants take 3 months to grow to harvest and then, in common with the farmers' grain crops, the moment of their cropping must be closely judged, for fine thread can only be made from young green plants whilst the coarser older fibers suitable for cord and rope are extracted a few weeks later. In the harvest, from the flax plant's sere and yellowed stems. Separating flax fibers from their stems is in itself a 2-week process, for the plants must be rotted and then beaten before the fibers can be separated with a special small sharp tool. Disc-shaped spindle whorls found in the farmers' settlements show that the resulting fibers were then spun from the open hand, in the same way that some country people still spin wool. Compared with oily sheep's wool, however, flax fibers are hard and brittle and require a particular touch, a special skill, to maintain the constant level of humidity that keeps the spinning fibers pliable and strong. Only then could the resulting balls of yarn have been woven into the fabrics found within the Faiyum farmers' settlements. Rough-shaped stones with various grooves and holes in them have been found in considerable numbers in the settlements and may well have been used as weights for inshore fishing nets. Some of these same stones, however, could also have been used as loom weights, for the scraps of fabric that survive have come from well-made plain woven lengths of linen cloth, made on a loom on which the warp threads were kept under constant tension as the weaver worked. With such looms, at the very least, the weaver would have had to have fixed pegs into the ground high enough to hold the beams on which the linen warp was set and from which the loom weights could have been hung. Such weaving necessarily entails the fastidious manipulation of rows of narrow threads, at one and the same time a physical and analytical activity. Such work requires a rapt preoccupation. These, then, the first known Egyptian fabrics, are the direct ancestors of the noble household industry which provided Pharaoh and his courtiers with their most splendid garments. Immensely durable, and bleaching to an elegant whiteness under the Egyptian sun, linen improves its qualities with every wash. Yet we have no idea of how the lakeside farmers used the linens that they wove. Despite the numerous pins and needles found within the settlements, and the bone awls and flints such as are employed for working leather and rawhide, there is no evidence of the kind of clothing, if any, that the farmers wore. Separating flax fibers from their stems is in itself a 2-week process, for the plants must be rotted and then beaten before the fibers can be separated with a special small sharp tool. Disc-shaped spindle whorls found in the farmers' settlements show that the resulting fibers were then spun from the open hand, in the same way that some country people still spin wool. Compared with oily sheep's wool, however, flax fibers are hard and brittle and require a particular touch, a special skill, to maintain the constant level of humidity that keeps the spinning fibers pliable and strong. Only then could the resulting balls of yarn have been woven into the fabrics found within the Faiyum farmers' settlements. Rough-shaped stones with various grooves and holes in them have been found in considerable numbers in the settlements and may well have been used as weights for inshore fishing nets. Some of these same stones, however, could also have been used as loom weights, for the scraps of fabric that survive have come from well-made plain woven lengths of linen cloth, made on a loom on which the warp threads were kept under constant tension as the weaver worked. With such looms, at the very least, the weaver would have had to have fixed pegs into the ground high enough to hold the beams on which the linen warp was set and from which the loom weights could have been hung. Such weaving necessarily entails the fastidious manipulation of rows of narrow threads, at one and the same time a physical and analytical activity. Such work requires a rapt preoccupation. These, then, the first known Egyptian fabrics, are the direct ancestors of the noble household industry which provided Pharaoh and his courtiers with their most splendid garments. Immensely durable, and bleaching to an elegant whiteness under the Egyptian sun, linen improves its qualities with every wash. Yet we have no idea of how the lakeside farmers used the linens that they wove. Despite the numerous pins and needles found within the settlements, in the bone awls and flints such as are employed for working leather and rawhide, there is no evidence of the kind of clothing, if any, that the farmers wore. 2. Sickle Sheen. Most ancient Egypt in the Neolithic. It is moving now, to see that telltale line of light along the cutting edge of a Neolithic Middle Eastern sickle blade, that unique polish made by contact of the flint with countless stems of ripening grain as a prehistoric farmer bent to bring in the harvest. That shine is where the modern West began. Just as the forms of the Faiyum farmers' sickles were the same as some of those used in the time of Pharaoh, so the life of those first farmers is that of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis. Yet the Neolithic revolution did not originate within the orbit of the river Nile. At the time that the Faiyum farmers were sowing their first crops, other farmers to the north and east had been employing the same techniques of cultivation for at least 5,000 years. Nor were the Faiyum farmers' crops, nor their domesticated animals indigenous to Egypt, or indeed to any part of Africa, not their cattle, not their sheep or goats, not their emmer, wheat or barley seed. Even the design of their flinted sickles had been imported. Their grain bins, too, with their muddy linings and their domestic baskets, were of a type that had long been made in the Levant. And though the reeds and rushes used to make their grain baskets are native to the marshes of the Nile, some of the abrasive fibers which were used to bind them together had been cut from palm trees, and these too appeared to have been imported into Egypt from southern Mesopotamia. In similar fashion, the techniques of linen weaving employed by the Faiyum farmers were equally alien, as were the flax plants whose fibers they employed. Far finer thread had been spun in the Levant in earlier millennia. With its obvious potential for use in bird traps and fishing nets, it may well have been that the plants from which such fine thread was spun were originally cultivated to serve the purposes of hunting rather than for making lengths of cloth. There is evidence of the route by which such things first came into the Nile Valley. Bone fragments and other scant remains from the Egyptian deserts suggest that traveling herders may have grazed domesticated sheep and goats on the Saharan plains and in the Red Sea hills millennia before farming had been established by the Faiyum Lake. Vast clusters of modest campsites from Syria down to Sinai hold the faintest traces of small groups of people who, like modern Bedouin, appear to have abandoned the settled life of farming to travel in annual migration from the mountains to the sea, sowing and harvesting at intervals on their journey. Such travelers, too, may well have come into the orbit of the Nile. And as we have already seen, the Faiyum farmers appear to have undertaken similar journeys of their own, returning to their lakeside meadows at harvest time. It is hardly surprising, then, that the Faiyum farmers' pottery also has alien origins, that the processes of tempering the clay with chopped reed, and of Burnishing and slipping the finished wares also appear to have come from the Levant and ultimately, also, from the region known as the Jazira, the island dash. The area, that is, between the upper Tigris and Euphrates river systems which is now divided between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. These same two areas, the Jazira and the Levant, were also the natural homelands of the stock and seed which the Faiyum farmers cultivated. Recent excavations show that, from around 11,500 BC and over a period of some 1,500 years, some settlements in northern Syria had exchanged hunter-gathering for the cultivation of the wild cereals and the domestication of the goats and sheep that were native to the region. And it was these, the same technologies and stock, that through the following millennia had filtered into Asia, Africa and Europe, north and west from the Levant to Anatolia, the Mediterranean and southern and eastern Europe, eastwards to the Persian Gulf, the Indies and South Asia, south along the northern coast of Africa to Spain and up the Nile to the Faiyum and beyond. In the broad scheme of things, therefore, the culture of the Faiyum farmers appears as but a tiny and somewhat isolated splinter, a few small communities in a remote oasis practicing a rudimentary version of a revolutionary way of life. Rudimentary, because the relics of the Faiyum farmers show them to have been unaffected by the cultural fluorescence that had developed and was still developing in some of the other farming communities in Eastern Europe, for example, even as the lakeside farmers had gathered their first known harvests. Far larger agricultural communities had been smelting copper implements for a considerable time, and some of these same settlements were also producing splendidly decorated pots and elegant ceramic sculptures of both animals and people. At this same time, too, farmers by the Black Sea were burying their dead with elaborate ornaments of beaten gold bearing lively images of their domesticated cattle, the first known use of the yellow metal on such a scale. In Anatolia, some shrine-like buildings at the center of extensive farming settlements had long since been vividly decorated with sculptures and paintings. One of these buildings, at least, also held a hall of enormous, square-cut, monolithic pillars, weighing several tons and decorated with images of animals. Each one of these enormous stones would have required large numbers of people for its transportation, shaping and emplacement, an activity which implies considerable social organization. Nor are these the oldest known examples of such complex enterprises. Stocked with the standard Levantine range of domesticated plants, animals and farming implements, farming settlements had been established on Crete and Cyprus and some of the Greek islands as early as the 8th millennium BC. In similar fashion, such immigrations must have been considerable undertakings, entailing voyages on the open sea with substantial cargoes of animals and seed, and boats much larger than those the Faiyum farmers had built to take even the biggest catches from their little lake. The Faiyum farmers, then, were but modest outposts of this brand new way of living, outposts established at a time when the local conditions had allowed them to flourish. Such had not always been the case. Round 10,000 BC, when the people of the Syrian settlements were engaged in the lengthy processes of adapting from hunter-gathering to farming, there had been a disastrous and lengthy desiccation throughout northern Africa, and most living things had migrated from the scorched savanna of the Sahara to the watered highlands of the Maghreb and Cyrenaica and down into the valley of the Nile. The rains had come, however, round 6500 BC, and so fiercely that they have been called monsoons. Sweeping upward from the south, they had greened the Sahara once again and reforested parts of the mountainous deserts to the east of the river Nile. These monsoons created large numbers of oases, which had supported bands of hunters, groups that fished and gathered local plants and fruit, ground wild grains and made distinctive types of pottery that are found today in desert graves. From the Sudan to Libya, some of these communities may also have domesticated the wild Saharan cattle, millennia before the settlers beside Lake Faiyum introduced their stock from the Levant and the Jazira. Another indigenous domestication is also suggested by the genetic components of the Saharan grain. Yet the scarcity of butchered bone within these settlements suggests that, like the modern-day herders of the Sudan, these communities kept their animals for supplies of blood and milk rather than for meat. And certainly, none of the Saharan peoples adopted the Levantine farming technologies or stock. So, presently they appear peripheral to the revolution that would spread outwards from the Jazira and Levant. Early Saharan history, however, is as yet little known and only comes into slightly sharper focus centuries after the farming settlements by the Faiyum Lake had been established, when the desert dwellers were making engravings of herding and hunting on the rocks of their oases. Direct contact between these desert peoples and the Faiyum farmers might be suggested by the beads of ostrich shell excavated in the lakeside settlements, whilst fragments of Amazonite, a hard green gemstone which has also been found within the Faiyum settlements, appear to have been collected from some rocky outcrops that today are in northwestern Chad on the southern side of the Sahara. Some of the spare elements of decoration, modest rows of bumps, which occasionally occur on the Faiyum pottery, are also reminiscent of forms that sometimes decorate the finer and more elaborate wares made by the Saharan herders. Egyptianness. This is in no way to suggest that pharaonic Egypt was either originated by or inspired by foreign cultures, whether those of the Sahara, or the Jazira or the Levant. The influence of the Saharan peoples is highly tenuous, whilst the farming revolution which started in the Jazira and the Levant did not maintain a single cultural identity during its lengthy journeyings into Europe, Africa and Asia beyond that which was inherent in its core technologies. And even those most fundamental elements underwent considerable adaptation. This was especially true of the Faiyum farmers who, for their very survival, were forced to radically recast the Middle Eastern Neolithic farming calendar. Unlike the grasslands of Europe, Africa, and Asia, which were greened and sustained by rainfall, no life-sustaining rains fell within the orbit of the river Nile in the time of its first farmers. Then, as now, most living things depended upon their direct contact with the waters of the river. From their beginnings, then, the farming communities of Egypt were distinctively Egyptian. Just as all of life within the orbit of the Nile, one of the world's most stable river systems, was governed by the river's rhythms and its dramatic annual flood, so all external influences on those who dwelt beside the river were inevitably and inexorably transformed. Pari passu, the particularities of the Faiyum farmers' calendar were those of Pharaoh's subjects also. The fundamental technologies of their farming, indeed, would hardly change until the coming of the Persians and the Greeks. And even then, the farmers' lives stayed much the same till modern times, a fact that underlines the explosive success of the introduction of alien seed and stock into the hothouse of the narrow valley of the Lower Nile. It also offers touching testimony to the unspoken presence of a peasant population that is so easily portrayed as a timeless mass of silent workers underpinning a succession of exotic and invasive governments. Until quite recently, indeed until the revolution and reforms of the last century, it was only the scribes and artists of the pharaohs who had given the Nileside farmers a voice within their writings, and a lively presence, also, in the scenes which decorate their tombs. 3. Merimda and el-Omari. Lower Egypt, 4800 to 4300 BC. A few centuries after the farmers had settled by the Faiyum Lake, at a time apparently around 4800 BC, another community, and one far larger than any of the lakeside settlements, was established just 60 miles to their north, at a site known now as Merimda, a place of ashes. Once it held the ruin of the oldest farming community that is known to have lived beside the river Nile, situated on a gentle mile-long slope that runs down from the western desert into the Nile Delta. Merimda sat on a bank of gravel, a product of the heavy rains which had deluged the deserts of North Africa in previous millennia and, in flooding down into the valley of the Nile, had deposited huge quantities of sand and flint all along the river's edge. The settlement had survived, indeed, precisely because this gravel fan once stood a few feet above the river's annual flood. Any contemporary settlements, which were set upon the fields below, are now deeply buried. So only the place of ashes yet remained of all that may have been, a 50-acre sprawl of sand, cinders and rubbish, grain bins and threshing floors, house walls and a few isolated burials, the deposit of a millennium and more of ancient life, buried now beneath some desert orchards, built directly on the gravel of the flood fan and sometimes part cut into it. Merimda's typical remains were of small round buildings with a central hearth, a house type that had long been built in the Levant. Here, though, on the edge off Nile's marshy delta, there had been a local touch, for some of the dorsals were made from the shin bones of native hippopotami. The frightening beasts were put to other architectural purposes, too, along with other animal bones. Their vertebrae and long bones were sometimes used to form a sort of pillar to support a roof. Now, a single hippopotamus, it has been estimated, would supply the meat of 5 cows or 50 sheep. Given the animal's huge size, the hunt must have been a communal enterprise, the prey brought down with harpoons with tips and barbs of ivory and bled with a stone knife or axe. A similarly communal spirit may also be detected in the disposition of some of Merimda's later houses, which were set out like streets, in rows. Here too were the ubiquitous Neolithic grain bins of mud-lined pits and woven baskets. At Merimda, though, unlike the settlements beside the Faiyum lake, the bins were separated into small groups so that each dwelling appears to have had its own individual grain stores. In one of these little houses, and most remarkably, for at Merimda almost everything had been shattered and scattered, a cooking pot survived intact, buried underneath a floor, covered by a mat and closed with a ceramic lid. The stout round vessel held a collection of small objects which had been carefully composed in a single symmetric pattern on the curving bottom of the pot. 5 nicely rounded, highly polished axe heads made from a number of variegated stones, part of what appears to be a splendid ivory bracelet, 2 small circular boxes also made of ivory and probably cut from hippopotamus teeth, and an eroded ivory figurine of a portly hippo sporting what appears to be the head of a gazelle or goat. Here, then, laid out in a domestic stew pot, were some fine axes and various precious little objects cut from the ivory of the most fearsome beast the Merimdan hunters ever stalked. You may, of course, put a variety of meanings on this collocation, that it is an offering to a deity or the remnants of a ritual designed to help a coming hunt or, more simply, treasure buried at the time of an enemy attack. Such narratives, however, tell more of the imaginations of their modern storytellers than they do about the ancient inhabitants of Merimda, for we know nothing of those people beyond that which has been recovered from the ruin of their settlements. All else is merely speculation. The fact of the pattern of these objects in the pot, however, cannot be disputed. Unlike the Faiyum farmers, where the patterns of cultivation, object making and decoration may have been unconscious reflections of a way of life, the arrangement in this Merimdan pot is a conscious manipulation of a group of man-made objects. Here, then, the fine-made axe heads are no longer work tools, but part of a pattern of images and objects whose properties and identities have been combined within a single silent dialogue, tools, that is, to paraphrase Claude Lévi-Strauss, which have been used for thinking with, and one of the first such gatherings of images to have survived from a region that, later, would excel in just such things. Such finds were rare, however, in the excavations at Merimda, where the great part of what the archaeologists have recovered over some 80 years of sporadic excavation since the site was opened in the 1920s obtains a certain monotony. Thousands of ceramic fragments, hundreds of small undistinguished objects made of bone and stone, some spare burials dotted through the dwellings. This was not a culture that made fine things. At the same time though, these modest relics tell exotic tales of contact with the peoples of the Sahara and the Levant, and this in turn shows that, unlike the Faiyum settlements, the Merimdans were part of a lively intercontinental exchange that was taking place during the Middle Eastern Neolithic Revolution. Like their neighbors beside the Faiyum Lake, however, the first Merimdans appear to have led semi-mobile lives, inhabiting modest accommodations and cultivating the Neolithic staples of emmer wheat and vetch and barley. They also consume large quantities of domestic sheep, goats and pigs, especially pigs. As well as taking hippopotami and fish, crocodiles, turtles and freshwater mollusks from the river. Fragments of ceramic ladles such as are required to scoop hot liquids from a cooking pot suggest that they also cooked in the manner of their Faiyum neighbors, on large pots on an open hearth. Though no similar ceramic ladles have been found within the Faiyum settlements, they are commonly found in the excavation of contemporary farming settlements of the Levant. Some of the other Merimdan wares from this same early phase share distinctive herringbone patterning with some of the ceramics of the settlements in the Levant and the Jazeera. A solitary vase with this same pattern was left, perhaps by a wandering Merimdan, in a cave close to the Red Sea coast, which had long been used as a shelter by traveling herdsmen, along with the design of their houses and the placement of solitary human burials within the living settlement. Such finds show an immediate and continuing Levantine connection. The following centuries, however, those of the middle of the 5th millennium BC, saw a change in Merimdan material culture, which appears to have had considerable contact with the Saharan desert dwellers, some of whose distinctive maces, adzes and harpoon points, and even fragments of their fine ceramics, have been found within the settlement, along with some bones of the distinctive long-horned Saharan cattle. At the same time, though, this secondary phase within the settlement also saw the manufacture of 2 barbed arrowheads, similar to those produced by the Faiyum farmers. These were so finely worked that they have usually only survived as broken fragments. One whole example, however, slender, thin and more than 3 inches long, was enthusiastically described by its excavator as the finest of all known Neolithic flints. At all events, such objects are clearly the products of a lively and adaptable society, and one, as well, with time to spare. As with the Faiyum settlements, no cemeteries have been found at Merimda. The odd graves that were sprinkled through the houses of the settlement being the individual burials of women and children interred during the later phases of the community's existence. Crouched in death, and usually set facing north, they had been laid to rest with the scantiest of grave goods in this, along with their isolation from other graves if not the living household up above, does not speak of a strong community of custom and belief within the community. Nonetheless, several of these lonely burials had grains of wheat cast over them, a gesture that would garnish a millennial tradition of Egyptian burial and a multitude of pharaohs' tombs as well. Tutankhamun's burial crypt, for one, contained a wooden trough holding dried and sprouted grain. Such were the continuing resonances of these most ancient Nilotic funerary rites. The cemeteries of el-Omari. During the later phases of Merimda, and the second half of the 4th millennium BC, other settlements were established near the ending of the narrow Nile Valley, and some 40 miles to the south, where the bordering cliffs start to widen like a trumpet's bell, an announcement of the beginning of the river's delta. Though the Saharan plains above the Nile Valley were already desiccating at this time, there was yet sufficient rainfall to sustain communities of farmer-fishermen in the wadis which drained down through the valleys bordering cliffs into the river's water meadows. And it was these communities, at sites like those at el-Omari by the Wadi Hof, and at Hawan close to modern Cairo, that made the oldest known Egyptian cemeteries, burying their dead with their faces turned towards the north, and crouched in the same poses as the house burials at Merimda. Here, then, for the first time, we are in the physical presence of some of Egypt's early farmers. Men, it would appear, were usually around 5 feet 6 inches, women, on average, some 4 inches shorter. There is little, though, amongst these burials to distinguish any racial type, just as their culture appears to have been part African and part Levantine, so the communities in these cemeteries are the same as those of later times in Egypt, a combination of different peoples bound into a single splendid society. More interesting, perhaps, are some of the incidental things that were buried with these people. One grave, for example, contained the oldest known Egyptian date pit, another, the body of an old lady who had been buried in midsummer with a sprig of flowering fleabane set upon her head, the yellow blooms intended, it appears, just as their properties would later be described in European herbals, to keep away the flies. The Merimda head. It was at Merimda, though, within the strata of the later phases of the settlement, deposited during the 200-year period following the middle of the 4th millennium BC, that archaeologists recovered the fragments of the oldest known sculpture of a human being ever to have been found in Egypt. A clay head as round as a potato, it is a well-made and surprising work. It is also the earliest known evidence of how people living in the valley of the lower Nile saw themselves, yet it is not in any way Egyptian. Just as a prehistorian observed that Merimda is not significantly different from contemporary villages in Palestine, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia, so the little sculpture belongs to a world of imagery that had grown up over previous millennia throughout the heartlands of the Neolithic Levant. More than 100 such heads are known. Some of them were directly modeled over human skulls, others fitted like masks to sculptured bodies of varying sizes and proportions and were made of a wide variety of materials. Altogether, they appear a single series of multiplying images, underlining the common circumstance, the order and identity, of the communities that made them. Many of these heads are decorated. Some were splashed with dripping lines of bitumen. Others, like the example from Merimda, were painted with a wash of white, others with ochre, viridian or black, the same pigments that the Faiyum farmers had used for cosmetics. Several of the heads were drilled with holes and suspended in nets of macrame and knotted cord, others seem to have been placed on plinths or buried under buildings that have been variously identified as temples or storerooms, shrines or houses. The purposes of these images, however, are utterly mysterious, for there is no direct evidence from any of these communities of either gods or governments and no evidence, indeed, of any separation or inclusion of religion, cult and ritual from the daily round. Smaller than a fist, Merimda's little head has holes impressed around its facade hat may have once held feathers or fibers to represent a beard and hair. It also has a hollow neck and could therefore have been mounted on a stick as part of some kind of display or joint activity. At all events, like all the other Neolithic statues, it offers direct evidence of how some of the members of these communities conceived and represented human beings. Expertly designed and crafted, as smooth and symmetrical as Merimda's barbed harpoon heads, the little face is made up of 6 beautifully modeled elements set in exact relationship to each other, the eyes, the nostrils and the nose and mouth being disposed in the same manner in which large flints were often worked, that is to say, in measured segments from a single center point, like the elements of a clock face. And, like a flint, the head is small enough to fit into a human hand while the gentle work of modeling was undertaken. A miniature Brancusi, it is one of the finest of all the Neolithic images of heads to have survived. Yet the image of itself is scary. The slanted oval holes which mark its eyes are closely set and deeply cut, the nostrils and the smaller holes beneath form an uneasy symmetry whilst the mouth is modeled like a wound, the upper lip set straighter than the lower, so that the void between them shapes a silent sound that echoes through the shadows of the eyes and nostrils. Many of the other Neolithic images are equally disquieting. The near life-size sculptured figures from Syria and Palestine, especially, are alien and otherworldly, plastered skulls with inlaid eyes that do not see and flattened mask-like heads far scarier than Halloween. In similar vein, some of the Anatolian wall paintings from the 8th millennium BC hold images of birds pecking at figures of the dead, dark images coupled with assemblages of Enormous and distorted figurative sculptures, with animal skulls and savage, bare-teethed felines. This, then, is the ethos of the Merimda head. Life on the farm, so it appears, was not a bed of roses. The big mistake. Physical evidence from Neolithic cemeteries from Syria to el-Omari shows that the first farmers paid a heavy price for their way of life. Though they still hunted and gathered wild foods, their crops and livestock had circumscribed their movements, and they were eating an increasingly narrow spectrum of foods and suffering a range of previously uncommon afflictions. Stress fractures due to heavy labor are common in their burials, as are the signs of osteoporosis, bad teeth and abscesses, the latter the direct result of chewing gritty stone ground flour. Women, especially, were physically changed by the daily labor, hour on hour, of kneeling to grind grain on a hand mill. An essential element of the early grain economies, this punishing repetitious labor had changed the shape of women's shoulders and caused their toes and heels to become arthritic and enlarged, these, the first physical signs of a separation of daily work between men and women. So, even in the hothouse of the Nile Valley, the early Neolithic era was no Eden. Recently, indeed, the farming revolution of itself has been famously characterized as humankind's first big mistake. Nonetheless, in the space of just a few millennia, an infinitesimal fragment in the span of human existence, large numbers of people across 3 connected continents had exchanged the age-old ways of hunter-gathering for a life of subsistence farming. What, then, was the attraction? Why had so many people adopted the grinding monotony of the agricultural round rather than a life of hunter-gathering? Given that the foundations of the pharaonic state were set so firmly and precisely on this Neolithic past, some understanding of its appeal, of its charisma, even, given its immediate effects, is fundamental to an understanding of the ancient Egyptian state, which in both its rituals and its imagery always looked back to these beginnings. A Neolithic revolution? For the Victorians, such dramatic transformations, as that in which bands of hunter-gatherers became farmers and the subjects of a king in a few thousand years, were explained by tales of colonization, by acts of individual genius or by divine intervention. Such explanations are no longer popular and are now seen as a limited set of hypothetical scenarios unable to resist an ever-growing mass of contradictory data. Nevertheless, the general terms of this inquiry into what happened in this key period of human history have hardly changed at all. This because a great deal of contemporary scientific jargon, the very language of the inquiry, contains its own inbuilt and somewhat similar scenarios. The Neolithic Revolution, for example, that most useful phrase, was concocted by the Australian archaeologist Vera Gordon-Childe in the 1920s from 2 19th century terms, the word Neolithic, Sir John Lubbock's term for the later or polished phases of the Stone Age, and the medieval word revolution, a term originally used to describe the movement of the wheel or the passage of the stars, and first provided with its present economic dimensions by John Stuart Mill. Childe later wrote that he had specifically concocted his phrase to combat the then current climate of ethnic stereotyping in European archaeology, in which the objects of prehistory were being ordered and described in terms designed to demonstrate that the motor of human history had always been the Aryan race. Childe, alternatively, had used his phrase to describe a genuine sea change he had detected amongst the relics of prehistory, one that ran right through an enormous mass of archaeological data he had gathered on 3 continents, and which was the product of a variety of different peoples. This was a fault line in their material possessions which, he had perceptively observed, separated the tools of hunter-gatherers from those of farmers. Not surprisingly, perhaps, given the contemporary climate, Childe's newly invented Neolithic revolution, a 2-word adventure story in itself, soon became a part of Western history. Childe's explanation for the rapid and widespread diffusion of his Neolithic revolution was primarily economic. Farming, he argued, had enormous material advantages over hunter-gathering. In times of ecological stress, food storage and animal husbandry were first-rate survival strategies, whilst in the good times, they offered prospects of a more prosperous and, literally, a more settled life. As far as Egypt was concerned, the establishment of the first farming settlements, Chab concluded, had been a direct response to the period of desiccation across North Africa which had driven populations out of the Saharan savannas and down to the highlands and rivers at its edges. Pharaoh's pyramids, he proposed, were the triumphant signs of the revolution's material prosperity, which had brought social and artistic progress in its wake. The die was cast. It hardly matters that later research has shown that there had been more than enough natural resources to support the hunter-gathering communities along the River Nile, nor that many of the large near-urban communities of early Neolithic farmers seem to have failed, nor even that further research has proved that climate change had not forced groups of Saharan hunter-gatherers to take up farming. At around 4000 BC, indeed, when the last traces of the Faiyum farming communities disappear, the levels of the annual Nile floods were generous and rising. The seductive notion that the calorie counts of different ways of living could be turned into quasi-historical narratives offer the novel possibility of building scientific histories from the relics of the distant past, tricked out with fashionable neo-evolutionary economics. Such narratives came to dominate accounts of what happened in prehistory to such an extent that, by the 1960s, the eminent archaeologist Louis Binford would claim that man's culture is but the sum of his extra-somatic means of adaptation to his environment. Yet economics offers no explanation whatever for those rare things on which the people of the Egyptian Neolithic lavished such enormous care: the clay head for Merimda, the patterns woven by the Faiyum basket weavers, their body paints, the perfect arrowheads and all those other shapes and forms that in the course of the next millennium would be carefully and consciously expanded and extended so that they came to embody the indelible identity of pharaonic Egypt. All that economic historians can offer by way of explanation of these things are vague speculations upon primitivism, art and aesthetic urges, and that, essentially, is why most modern visions of ancient Egypt are still filled with ancient mysteries and why its gorgeous tombs and temples and all those lively objects in museum cases still lie in an intellectual never-never land. The character of change. How then to proceed? First, perhaps, by acknowledging that the early farmers were possessed of more than rumbling stomachs and a knack for napping flint. By acknowledging that, as the human genome has not changed in the last 100,000 years, let alone the last 12,000, the early farmers were as intelligent as we are, that no natural pseudo-evolutionary principles were at work, and that an axe, as Levi-Strauss observed, does not generate another axe. In short, there's little that was mechanically inevitable of what occurred at the ending of prehistory within the valley of the Lower Nile. We will never, of course, recreate the past's true temper. We don't even know what the man on the Clapham omnibus is thinking. The Faiyum farmers are long gone and, as with all the dead, their life and times are represented now in odd, fragmented ways. Some things, though, are sure. The essence of that millennial journey in which settlements of subsistence farmers living on the Lower Nile were formed into a national community and erected perfect pyramids whose corridors were filled with sacred literature, is a history of people thinking. Hindsight is the historian's special aid to understanding something of this millennial process. Looking back, we can see changes taking place within those first communities of farmers, see choices being made, see something, then, of how they thought. Just as the things made in those communities were part of the patterns and rhythms of their lives, so the tensions that arose within them manifest themselves in images such as Merimda's fierce little head. Hindsight, as well, points up a unique fact about the progress of the Neolithic in the Nile Valley. Unlike the vast majority of their contemporaries, the communities that farmed the lands beside the River Nile undertook a series of extraordinary changes during the first 15 centuries of their existence in every aspect of their lives other than that of the single sustaining activity of farming. There was, therefore, a powerful underlying energy at work within these small communities, an energy that, hindsight tells us, led to the creation of the pharaonic state, an energy which, as hindsight shows, held inklings of a unique conception of the order of the world. This is in no way to suggest that these extraordinary changes were the product of an intellectual revolution, though a common enough conceit in academia, where words are king, such a progression, from thought to deed, is utterly unproven in this silent pre-literary age where all the evidence that we will ever have is held within the things that yet remain. These things, however, show that the beginning of this extraordinary adventure on the lower Nile lay in the change between the life ways of the farmers in their fields and those of the hunter-gatherers who traveled continuously around the seasons of the year. Survival in that hand-to-mouth existence had depended on the strong internal order of the group of travelers. The farmers, on the other hand, for their survival, had to impose a strong order upon a relatively small area of the natural world through the processes of cultivation and domestication. This, perhaps, tells something of the impulses which kept them bending at their harvests, despite their aches and pains. From the hunter-gatherers, the Nileside farmers had inherited a profound understanding of the interlinking processes of the natural world, the stars, the sun, winter, summer and the flood, an understanding that yet remained an essential component of all human life. Now, though, as they worked, the farmers were manipulating some of those same natural processes. By their very labor, they were redefining the universe in which they lived and their place within it. We should allow the possibility, therefore, that although the lives of Neolithic farmers were doubtless shorter than our own, they need not have been more brutish or more nasty, for they had changed their relationship to the world round them and sensed a new potential in it, and it was this that carried them through the hardships of the early Neolithic, the inklings of a great adventure. Within the orbit of the lower Nile, farming had unique effect. Following millennia of development in the Levant, it had immediately blossomed in the sheltered valley that held the world's most fertile soil, a burning sun and a superfluity of sweet fresh water. Little wonder, then, that after adapting the Levantine farming year to the rhythm of their river, Egypt's first farmers continued to adapt and change the order that the processes of farming had imposed on life beside the Nile, and the order which the Nile, in turn, imposed upon its farmers, became the dynamos of a millennium and more of development and change. Right from the beginning, change was swift. Egyptian grain put surplus food into the hunter-gatherer's hand-to-mouth economy, to that extent, and in the case of Egypt, Child's economic thesis is correct. The later Merimdans, for example, appear to have been the first farming community in Egypt to live within their settlement right around the year. And at the same time, the change of the location of the settlement's grain bins from the communal sites of the Faiyum farmers to separate groups of bins beside individual dwellings at Merimda suggests that the community was no longer directing its efforts to maintaining the integrity of the group and the manner of hunter-gatherers in that divisions based upon separate dwellings were arising inside their community. It was at this same time, too, that specific areas inside the Merimdan dwellings were assigned for the purposes of food preparation and for flint knapping, underlining, in all probability, a demarcation of male and female roles inside the community that may also have been reflected in a growing separation between the activities of child-rearing and hunting, which, in modern hunter-gatherer communities at least, is less pronounced. Here, then, is the beginning of the ancient Egyptian household. Few distinctive images survive from the age of Egypt's first farmers, just the clay head from Merimda and a handful of more modest pieces, similarly cast in international Neolithic style. Nor, perhaps, should we expect that such things were ever made in quantity. Hindsight shows that, of themselves, the fundamental elements of the creative processes by which such things were made, were the primary ingredients of their daily lives: sowing and the harvest, the sun and moon, the silt plain, the ivory-colored cliffs, and the animals and plants and people that lived within the orbit of the river, those same elements which, in symbol and reality, came to play exactly the same role in Pharaoh's courtly culture, where they held ageless and unfathomable resonance. 4. The Badarians. Middle Egypt, 4400 to 4000 BC. The remains of the first community that is known to have farmed within the closed confines of the cliff-lined Nile Valley were discovered in 1923 in what today is Middle Egypt, in a little village, the Isbet Alad El Hag Ahmed, some 220 miles south of modern Cairo, on the east bank of the Nile. A handful of sherds had attracted the English archaeologist Guy Brunton to the site. In a decade of surveying and excavation in the Nile Valley, he had handled thousands of ancient pots but had never seen anything like this high-shining nut brown ware before, with what he later described as a ripple running over its surface. And, most intriguingly, although Brunton had immediately seen that the sherds were very ancient, he had also seen that they could not be assigned to any known period, that they were, therefore, the relics of a previously unknown culture, as was common in the valley of the Egyptian Nile, the Isbet Alad El Hag Ahmed. The farm of the boy of Mecca pilgrim Ahmed had been built on the ruins of mud brick buildings of early Christian and Roman times which, in turn, had been erected within the confines of pharaonic and prehistoric cemeteries. And fragments from all these different eras lay all around the little settlement, in its alleyways and yards. A prime problem, therefore, when Brunton began to excavate was to separate the jumble of this common history, the ruins and the graves. So it was not until much later in that first season, whilst digging at a depth of some 8 feet, that his workmen opened a grave which held another example of the same shining pottery that he had first found lying in the dust and chaff of the street above. Though badly damaged, the body that lay beside the pot appeared to have been placed in the normal prehistoric pose, set on its side with its arms gathered together and its legs pulled sharply up towards the chest. 3 objects had been put by its feet: a small, black, bell-mouthed pot decorated with geometric patterns, a large flint knife shaped like a leaf, and a slab of silvery selenite, a crystalline sulfate of lime which appeared to have been framed in wood for use, Brunton suggested, as a mirror. A round pink pot with 4 stout handles and a rough-made jar had been laid down the front of the body, and there as well, close by the hands, lay a beautifully rippled bowl, a near-complete example of the same high-shining pottery that Brunton had spotted at the beginning of the work. During the following 2 winter seasons, Brunton's excavators uncovered hundreds of similar burials in a 10-mile stretch northwards of the village, all set in the little deserts which lay all along and underneath the valley's fringing cliffs, beyond the river and its fields of silt. From the beginning, Brunton saw that the people who had been buried with these shining pots were cultivators, and that some of the flints placed in their graves bore comparison with those from the Faiyum, an observation extended by more recent studies which have shown that both the methods of flint working and the grain and animal stock these people used were derived from the older Neolithic cultures to the north, those excavated at Merimda and el-Omari, as, indeed, were the forms of some of their pottery. During the second season of the excavation, with Brunton working his way across a landscape filled with graves of many diverse periods, a flint specialist, Gertrude Caden Thompson, joined the expedition with the specific aim of locating and excavating a single site that held a succession of prehistoric habitation levels, one above the other. This, to clarify the then little-known epics of Egyptian prehistory. She had already prospected other areas of Upper Egypt to find such a location. Now she found the perfect site not far from Brunton's camp, a small spur of sand beneath the valley cliffs, with flint and pottery lying just beneath the desert's surface. Her excavation was a complete success, even to the extent that, after cutting down through what we now know to have been a millennium and more of later prehistoric settlement, she found shards of Brunton's high shining pottery on the surface of a long buried sand dune. So just a year after Brunton's initial discovery of some mysterious shining pots of no known period, Caden Thompson had proved that the people who had been buried with them had been the earliest inhabitants of her site, and indeed, they yet remained the first known farmers within the valley of the Nile. Brunton dubbed the owners and, presumably, the makers of the shining pottery as Badarians, after the local town of el-Badari. Scientific analyses have since provided dates to show that they had flourished between 4,400 and 4000 BC. The Badarians had lived, therefore, at the same time as the later phases of Merimda and the other settlements nearby, and they had also been the contemporaries of the later generations of Faiyum farmers whose settlements and grain bins were discovered by the remarkable Caden Thompson in the same years in which she undertook her pioneering excavation at Badari. Badarian Pottery. Since the 1920s, some further scanty settlements and yet more graves containing the Badarians' distinctive shining pottery have been discovered both in Middle Egypt and the surrounding deserts, and further south in Upper Egypt, though none of these sites have yielded anything like the wealth of artifacts and data that Brunton and Caden Thompson first found in the area around Badari. Taken altogether, however, the Badarians now comprise a population of around 1,000 graves, whilst the spread of sites represents a commonality of culture amongst the first communities of farmers within the Nile Valley, which is not true of the various earlier settlements to their north. The Badarians' principal industries, so Brunton later wrote, were knapping, tanning and weaving, mat and basket making, and pottery. It was in the last of these crafts that they excelled, whereas the pottery of Merimda and the Faiyum farmers has a rudimentary air. The Badarians made most splendid wares, indeed. The quality and craft of the dark shining bowls and dishes whose shards had first attracted Brunton to excavate at Badari was never again equaled within the Nile Valley. Not for nothing had their discoverers described those first few shards as beautiful, and the shadowed shelters of a Badarian settlement the perfect glossy bowls must have appeared as a sort of superfruit, the fragile dishes seemingly to float. A similar striated effect to the ripple which had caught Brunton's eye within the rubbish of the little village has been employed throughout the ages by many different sculptors, who, after using a variety of serrated cutting tools to establish and define the forms of their work, then left the linear marks made by those tools to emphasize the shapes they had created. Both the later bronzes of Henry Moore and the slaves of Michelangelo are part covered in just such marks, the former having been produced by clay modeling tools, the latter with toothed marble chisels. The Badarian potters appear to have used similar if somewhat simpler and more modest implements, from notched pottery shards to fish bones, to scrape the hard clay with a precision which produced a near-perfect uniformity and a spinning circularity similar to that which craftsmen of later ages would achieve when working on a potter's wheel. The Badarians, however, built their pots up from a fixed base and let the clay dry to a leathery hardness before shaving it down with the tools that left those distinctive rippled textures which they chose on occasion not to smooth away. Such rippled surfaces, however, already had an ageless heritage in the time of the Badarians, for similarly textured patternings were regularly produced in everyday activities like scraping animal hides, weaving and flaking flints. And taking these everyday procedures and elevating them with an extraordinary finesse, the Badarian potters had done what Pharaoh's craftsmen would do time and time again, in later ages. Although monumental in their form, the Badarians' high shining rippleware pots are modest in their size whilst their thin and slightly wobbly edges emphasize their fragility and, to us today, who are used to a mechanical perfection, the fact that each one has been individually made just 15 inches high. The grander pieces are wide-mouthed, straight-sided vessels that, as some of them show the marks of ash and evidence of mending, were presumably used as cooking pots. The smaller pieces, individual cups, and a variety of bowls with both flat and rounded bases, are very light, the work of shaving them down too. Their crisply sculpted profiles having trimmed the clay so finely as to leave the bowls as slim as modern porcelain and so fragile that, when they were buried with the dead, many of them were shattered at the filling of the grave by the pressure of the sand. Though later potters did not continue to make such remarkably fine vessels, the forms of the more utilitarian Badarian wares served as a font of a ceramic tradition within the Nile Valley for a millennium and more. So seamless, indeed, was the transition to the wares of later centuries that the modern definition of the first part of this pottery tradition as a separate culture called Badarian is largely geographical, for most of their pottery has been found in Middle Egypt rather than in Upper Egypt, where most of the pottery of the following phases of prehistory has been found. That the Badarians' utilitarian wares are similar in their forms to the less skilled productions of their northern contemporaries in Merimda and the Faiyum, suggests that they may well have been adopted from the older northern settlements, along with the other technologies of the Neolithic revolution. Yet, this domestic pottery was also beautifully made, as if the extraordinary care that the Badarian potters had expended on their finest wares had trained their hands and eyes to make fine forms. Unlike their high-shining pots, however, these domestic wares reflect the age-old processes in which coils and knobs of kneaded clay are squeezed and kneaded and built up into the shape of the finished pot. Given that clay shrinks slightly as it dries and shrinks again when fired in a kiln, the splendid generosity of form that enlivened so many of the Badarians' fired and finished products would have required the creation of some remarkably vigorous shapes in fresh wet clay, as well as drawing on the traditions of the northern settlements. The Badarian potters also elaborated the shapes of some of the fruit and vegetables they harvested and which they used inside their settlements for a variety of purposes. Other than for eating, the shiny brown nuts of the dom palm, the dimple-textured eggs of ostriches, the swelling domes of gourds. Some of the Badarians' domestic wares still bear the rippled marks of their final shaping. Others were burnished to a high shine by rubbing the half-dried clay with a smoothly rounded sherd or stone. Sometimes these pots were left matte around the rim, so that they resemble half-peeled fruits. Many of them, however, were entirely burnished and given jet black bands around their upper sections, a finish that was probably produced by placing a previously fired pot upside down in smoldering ash. A trademark now of a millennium of Egyptian prehistoric pottery, this distinctive luster was first made, it has been suggested, in imitation of the way the edges of gourds that have been cut for use as containers are sometimes treated in a fire, to add strength to the rim. In the hands of the Badarian potters, the effect was most beautifully measured, the black blaze playing against the vessel's various forms in rich and subtle ways in a multiplying series of ceramic masterpieces. If ever a people was defined by its products, it is surely Brunton's Badarians, as their potters played with clay made from the silt of their slow-flowing river in the forms and textures of their daily lives. Badarian landscapes. You may drive today through the Badarian heartlands, bouncing over the spurs of whitish sand and gravel, within that narrow desert that lies between the eastern cliffs and the flat plowed fields which run down to the Nile. It is a heraldic landscape. In one side window, the horizon is low and gentle, green and sparkling fresh with bright blue sky above. In contrast, the opposing window is entirely filled with bone-dry limestone cliffs whose surfaces are tanned with so-called desert varnish, a product of the deposit over long millennia of wind-borne particles of clay. In Badarian times, the modern fields beside the river would have been water meadows with a profusion of reeds and rushes fringed by acacia and halfa grass. In summer, these meadows were as hard and parched and hot as the out-off-season wetlands by the Faiyum lake, though in the months following the flood, they could be as cool and misty as a Surrey common at a summer's dawn. The Badarians, however, appear to have favored the little deserts at the foot of these bone-dry cliffs for their accommodation where, like Cade and Thompson, they would have been alternately grilled by the fierce reflected heat from the cliffs or shivering in the unbroken force of northwest winter blasts and where, during the winter months, so the bodies in their burials imply they must have slept, wrapped up in skins and fur. And yet there was no scarcity of food. The wetlands, which were amply spread across the valley floor and filled with game, provided abundant land for cultivation. So the Badarians stored their harvests in large clay bins within their desert settlements, where they also ground their grain as they required, and sometimes, too, they turned their flour to bread, for loaves were found in several of their graves. A form of porridge also appears to have been a common food, ladled out of the cooking pots into hand-sized bowls from which it was consumed, perhaps, with the aid of the delicately made spoons of bone and horn and ivory which were also buried with the dead. Meat, too, was on the menu, and in generous quantities. Alongside their domesticated herds of oxen, sheep and goats, hunting and gathering were still considerable activities. The bones of birds and fish were also plentiful inside the settlements, as were wild seeds and pulses, and the roots of reeds and grasses, some of which could be as sweet as filberts whilst others would have been so fragrant yet so bitter that they could only have served as perfume. You may drive today through the Badarian heartlands, bouncing over the spurs of whitish sand and gravel, within that narrow desert that lies between the eastern cliffs and the flat plowed fields which run down to the Nile. It is a heraldic landscape. In one side window, the horizon is low and gentle, green and sparkling fresh with bright blue sky above. In contrast, the opposing window is entirely filled with bone-dry limestone cliffs whose surfaces are tanned with so-called desert varnish, a product of the deposit over long millennia of wind-borne particles of clay. In Badarian times, the modern fields beside the river would have been water meadows with a profusion of reeds and rushes fringed by acacia and halfa grass. In summer, these meadows were as hard and parched and hot as the out-off-season wetlands by the Faiyum lake, though in the months following the flood, they could be as cool and misty as a Surrey common at a summer's dawn. The Badarians, however, appear to have favored the little deserts at the foot of these bone-dry cliffs for their accommodation where, like Kate and Thompson, they would have been alternately grilled by the fierce reflected heat from the cliffs or shivering in the unbroken force of northwest winter blasts, and where, during the winter months, so the bodies in their burials imply, they must have slept, wrapped up in skins and fur. And yet there was no scarcity of food. The wetlands, which were amply spread across the valley floor and filled with game, provided abundant land for cultivation. So the Badarians stored their harvests in large clay bins within their desert settlements, where they also ground their grain as they required, and sometimes, too, they turned their flour to bread, for loaves were found in several of their graves. A form of porridge also appears to have been a common food, ladled out of the cooking pots into hand-sized bowls from which it was consumed, perhaps, with the aid of the delicately made spoons of bone and horn and ivory which were also buried with the dead. Meat, too, was on the menu, and in generous quantities. Alongside their domesticated herds of oxen, sheep and goats, hunting and gathering were still considerable activities. The bones of birds and fish were also plentiful inside the settlements, as were wild seeds and pulses, and the roots of reeds and grasses, some of which could be as sweet as filberts whilst others would have been so fragrant yet so bitter that they could only have served as perfume. The farmers' generous and variegated diets appear to have been part contingent on a round of travel following the seasons of the year. Recent excavations show that the Badarians moved up and down the valley of the Nile and into the surrounding deserts. In autumn, when the broad valley in the region of el-Badari was entirely flooded, they appear to have traveled with their herds out onto the dry plains above the valley cliffs, where the ancient rough stone walls that run across the sandy hills for mile upon mile may yet reflect some of their fences and corrals. There, too, up on the high plateau, the Badarians hunted game. Ostrich feathers, the fur of desert hare and the hides of foxes and gazelle have all been found within their settlements and cemeteries. Some groups, on the other hand, seem to have moved further up the valley in high summer, for a small encampment 150 miles to the south of Badarian Upper Egypt, at a site known now as Maghar Dendera, appears to have been inhabited. Only at that time of year, when the wider meadows of Middle Egypt were entirely desiccated and grazing had completely disappeared. At Maghar Dendera, so the fish bones in the hearts informed its excavators, the Badarian sub-catches of the large fish that lived in the middle of the river. Here, too, the steeper, narrower floodplain would have allowed the herders and their flocks to stay close to the river, and later, when the flood returned, it would not have forced them to retreat to the bottom of the valley's cliffs, as it would have done in Middle Egypt. The absence of ponds within this encampment, indeed, informs us that the Badarians left it precisely at the beginning of winter when the floodwaters were receding, at the time, that is, when the wide meadows in the area of el-Badari were drying out and were ready once again for planting and, a little later on, for grazing cattle too. Such constant journeying would explain why the remains of many Badarian settlements are so scanty and why so many of the pots that have been found within them were broken and have been mended. Such living quarters were not permanent dwellings, sticks and matting appearing to have served as the main materials for human shelter, grain stores, generally, being more solid structures. Such transitory accommodations are similar to those of the modern Nilotic pastoralists of South Sudan, who live alongside their great dusty herds of longhorn cattle, and whose predecessors and one-time contemporaries of the Badarians also appear to have spent the year in traveling and watering their animals in the oases of the Sahara. Not that the ancient Egyptians would ever be great homemakers. Even the greatest pharaohs passed their lives in mostly modest mud brick buildings hardly worthy of their archaeological designation as palaces. And in pharaonic times, as well, the gathered grain was often better accommodated than were the harvesters themselves. Until quite recently, indeed, the villagers of the Nile Valley lived in sprawling open ways, moving during the year with their families, their bedding and their animals from house to hut, from their main dwellings in little deserts beneath the valley cliffs down to their fields below, extending and rebuilding their various accommodations all the while, as they saw fit. As they traveled, the Badarians took some of their finest and most fragile wares along with them. Fragments of high-shining pottery have been found in some of their most modest settlements, in both the desert and the river's valley. In similar fashion, the requirements of the Badarian potters, their clay and fuel, access to ample water and the makings of a simple kiln to fire their pots, could also have been accommodated into this semi-mobile way of life, just as to this day some nomadic peoples carry the equipment to make fine carpets on their travels. That the finest Badarian pottery appears to have been made in relatively small quantities yet has been found in such a wide range of locations tells a great deal about its makers, as does the fact that its limited repertoire of forms was reproduced over several centuries without suffering any loss of quality or character. That generation after generation of potters communicated their craft with such fidelity suggests an intimacy of learning, potting, so it would appear, on a modest scale such as is found in some small communities today, where it is a domestic activity in which people of different ages and status within a single household contribute to various aspects of a pot's production, from the making of its clay to the firing of the kiln. In such circumstances, the potters are usually women, which in turn suggests the possibility that the wide diffusion of Badarian pottery reflects an exchange of women, the anthropologist's intermarriage between different semi-pastoral groups. Indeed, evidence of just such an exchange is to be found, perhaps, in a flamboyant type of grey pottery known as Tajan ware, which is usually regarded as the product of a Badarian subculture. Similar to contemporary wares made in the Sudan and the Sahara, such small quantities of Tajan wares are presently known to exist could well have been produced inside a single intermarried group. Here, then, pottery has come to stand as a kind of history. Nor, in the case of the Badarians, does this equation seem unreasonable. For each one of their high-shining pots was conceived as a precious visual object, a kind of presentation. That the same few forms were carefully repeated down through generations also shows that each and every one of these precious vessels was part of a consciously maintained tradition. For both their makers and their users, the presentation which the potters offered was that of a mark of identity of a distinctive community, in the same way that today the corpse of someone buried with one of those same pots is known as a Badarian. It is this identification of a prehistoric community by pottery type and modern place name that provides the basis of a meta-history for late prehistory, a chronology of ceramic type and form which has recently been extended to take in all of Egypt's history and which has become so all-pervasive that everything excavated within the orbit of the Nile is now dated and defined by the pottery. That is its inevitable accompaniment, pots in history. The idea of building a history from pots came from an Englishman, one William Matthew Flinders Petrie, Guy Brunton's mentor in Egyptian archaeology and arguably the only truly original mind, other than that of Jean-François Champollion, the decipherer of hieroglyphics, ever to have worked in Egyptology. Petrie had been led to his invention in the 1890s by tens of thousands of unfamiliar and rather alien pots that he had been excavating from a series of prehistoric desert cemeteries in Upper Egypt. Their sheer volume, Petrie recognized, required a simple system of classification for their accurate description in a scientific memoir, such as he produced upon a yearly basis, possessed of the ability to order phenomenal amounts of forms and patterns in his head. Petrie sorted his plethora of pots into a small number of basic types black-topped, red-polished and the like, whose forms, he assumed, had slowly changed through time. He then crossed his pottery types with another data set derived from a system that he described as sequence dating, in which individual pots that he knew to have been contemporary to each other, those, that is, which had been found within a single grave, were given a single common number, say, sequence date 30 or SD42. Using paper slips and spills of cardboard, after a deal of sorting throughout a London summer, Petrie produced a single chart that showed his basic pottery types changing within the numbered order of his sequence dates. Thus, though there were no fixed dates to which the system could be tied, the tens of thousands of pots that Petrie had excavated were accurately organized in the order of their manufacture. So successful was Petrie's system that when other archaeologists dug other prehistoric cemeteries, almost everything they found could be accommodated within the system and described by the letters and numbers of a pottery type and sequence date. All that was required, therefore, for the scientific publication of excavations such as those of Brunton and Caden Thompson at el-Badari, was that they described their finds in Petrie's terminology, recorded any previously unknown types or subtypes with drawings and provided them with a sequence date. For more than half a century, the system was the sole measure of the order of Egyptian prehistory. Then, with the advent of scientific dating in the 1950s, the decade after Petrie's death, carbon-14 readings provided broad confirmation of the order of the changing forms of Petrie's pottery types and awarded some of them approximate dates in time. Since then, there have been major refinements and extensions to Petrie's charts, but no fundamental changes to his system. Its application, however, provides surprises, not the least of which is the puzzling information that, unlike the pottery forms of later ages, Badarian pottery seems to have appeared quite suddenly and fully formed beside the Nile. There is no clue as to its origin. The Badarians and their fine pottery, their bags and traps, their fires and herds, their settlements and graveyards, appear, as it were, from nowhere. This, though, is not a cue for a modern pseudo-mystery waiting on a breakthrough to reveal a hitherto unknown opening chapter of Egypt's ancient history. Unlike the continuous cultural tradition that Petrie's pottery chart so carefully lays out for later ages, all of Egypt's earliest known communities, the Faiyum farmers, the Merimdans and the rest, appear in exactly the same sudden way. Like the Badarians, they all seem, as it were, to have come from nowhere. How, then, to make a history from such unrelated fragments? First, perhaps. By observing that, although the myths of later ages variously depict the prehistoric Nile Valley as a field for invasion, repopulation and colonization, there's no evidence at all that the Badarians or any other of these prehistoric cultures came from somewhere else. There is evidence, however, though it is scanty and erratic, of people having lived within the Nile Valley for as long as there have been people, and even earlier, for the remains of a small and somewhat delicate ancestor of Homo sapiens, one Egyptopithecus suxus, have been found near the Faiyum. One day, perhaps, traces of the Badarians' immediate predecessors may be found. It is likely, though, that their relics have been swept away, just as have the houses and settlements of most of those who have ever lived upon the flood plain of the Nile, obliterated by the changing passage of the river and its silt. All that has survived are fragments of things that were placed beyond the river's reach. Egypt's most ancient history, then, can only be constructed like a necklace, as separate beads of amber, a series of separate and sometimes vivid little moments, set upon a string of time. The trick is to construct the necklace so that more beads can be added later on, as other ancient things are brought again into the light. The living people. As for the Badarians, their burials show them to have been an amiable and peaceful people. Brunton found many elderly and white-haired folk within their cemeteries and few instances of broken bones or other injuries or conditions resulting from strife or deprivation. Nor were there many tools within their graves, no sickles and few adzes. Hunting equipment, on the other hand, was common in male burials, both arrows and boomerang-like throw sticks similar to those used by the later ancient Egyptians to bring down duck and geese within the river marshes. By way of contrast, the near-contemporary graves of Sudanese herders contained considerable quantities of weapons, and sometimes, too, the skulls of long-horned bulls were intertwined amongst the corpses of the dead, a close physical identification with animals that is quite absent from the Badarian cemeteries. As to their appearance, most Badarians were around 5 feet tall, a few, though, were much taller and some were very muscular. The men were generally clean-shaven and wore their hair quite long. Some of the women had fringes and plaits fixed up with combs of bone or ivory. The color of their hair varied from light brown to black, its texture from straight to curly, which is the same mixture found in earlier and later populations of the Nile Valley. As anthropological analyses serve to underline, the Badarians were of the same racial mix as the ancient Egyptians who would follow them. The dead were usually decorated with a mass of jewelry, swags of heavy necklaces threaded on strings of animal hair or flax, with beads of shells and ivory, or hammered out from natural copper nuggets gathered from the eastern desert, or cut from steatite, a kind of soapstone, that was often fired like pottery, so that it obtained a mysterious blue-green glaze. A wealth of other beads as well were cut from semi-precious stones brought from outside the Nile Valley, and these same stones, carnelians and jaspers, siltstones and breccias, serpentines, and alabasters, along with an impressive range of local limestones, red, pink, gray and green, hard and shiny, soft and matte, were also used for making little vases. Men sometimes wore a single string of large beads around their necks or on their arms, and ropes of glazed beads also, at their waists. Women and children might wear heavy necklaces, and most young girls had girdles and headbands made from threaded shells. Both sexes wore ivory bracelets and ear studs, and people of all ages were buried with little pouches containing the ingredients of body paint, the makings of a maquillage that would last till ancient Egypt's ending. Nuggets of green malachite and ochres were also left beside the corpses, with what appears to have been a medium of grease or fat scooped up into a shell, though one might imagine that body pigments would be better applied with a medium which would not melt or run so easily, such as the castor oil that the Badarians pressed from the seeds of the wild plant. Like the people of the Faiyum and Merimda, the Badarians ground and mixed their cosmetics on small Stone pallets. Stained and polished by years of use, many of these pallets were also buried with the dead. Both sexes, Brunton found, had been buried in clothing cut like kilts and caftans, made from animal skins and linen. Brunton's textile specialist, Thomas Midgley, reported that the weaving was almost as refined as the high-shining pottery, plain weave. Ratio warp weft 1:1. Pix 28 times 26. Color dark brown. All yarns doubled, the weft slightly less twisted than the warp. The warp yarns are remarkably parallel to each other, but the weft is at a fairly acute angle. The open character of the weave is pronounced, as in other Badarian cloths. Such fine linens, it appears, were worn next to the skin, the leatherwork, of antelope, goat and what seemed to Brunton to have been cat pelts, serving for the outer garments, which were skillfully worked and sometimes sewn with fringes. Needles were common in the graves of both men and women, and there were many different types of them, from bone awls and bodkins such as might have been used for basketry and leatherwork, to fine sewing points stored in special small bone cases, that hardly any instruments of common daily labor were found within the cemetery suggests that needlework was considered an agreeable activity. The graves from which this wealth of information was extracted were simply made in small and oval in their shape, like hearths or wheat bins, into which the dead were fitted as if into a womb. The sandy gravel in which most of them were cut was seldom stable. Some graves were plastered with wet mud along their sides, others had low brick walls built in them with roofs of wood and rush. Even if such arrangements token nothing more than a desire to physically protect a corpse, they witness a belief in the vulnerability of the dead and, hence, their continuing presence in some manner, a sensibility that finds further testimony in the charcoal and ash which Brunton found within the graveyards. Pots were set up in little hollows in the ground, and surrounded with tamarisk boughs or other brushwood. And then was cooked grain taken, perhaps, from nearby storage bins, and meat which had been carved up with saw-edged knives. These hearths, then, had cooked burial feasts, or served in some other observance of the dead. The burial of the dead, with their fine clothes, their jewelry, their beauties drinking cups and their carefully combed hair, one might imagine the Badarian dead had been dressed up for a party, such as would later be drawn out upon the walls of ancient Egyptian tomb chapels. Most of the goods left in these graves, as well, are those that give delight, wrapped in leathers, linens and fine furs. The bejeweled corpses were accompanied on occasion by ostrich feathers placed fanwise in their graves. Where, though, was the party? The Badarians, after all, were familiar with the realities of death in a hot climate, the sharp smell of decay coming fast and pungent in the heat, the need to dress and compose the body before rigor mortis set in, the breaking of the shining pottery with the filling of the grave and immediately afterwards, as Brunton testifies, the likelihood of robbery. Nonetheless, each grave was laid out with a fastidious and individual care. Like the pattern left in the Merimda cooking pot, each burial was arranged as an individual presentation, a kind of dialogue. On the broadest level, that of the language of these silent dialogues, every grave holds within it the trappings of a person whom some of the grave goods identify as a member of the culture that we call Badarian. In this light, the deposition of the finest pottery within the graves, pottery whose manufacture required such concern and skill, appears like the remnants of the cemetery feasts. As a part of a dialogue of care between the living and the dead, the forging and maintaining of a joint community. At the same time, however, each and every grave also holds its own unique collection of burial goods, cosmetics, clothes, and jewelry, domestic utensils and hunting gear, even a mirror and a frame, and all of them carefully disposed around the body in a different order in every separate grave. The act of burial, therefore, represented a particularization of an individual inside the common order of a close-knit and well-defined community. Set within communal cemeteries, such burials were also part of a continuing Connection between the communities of the living and the dead. Just as the living, at the time of funeral, arranged separate identities for all the dead, so the memories of the buried dead provided the people of the living settlements with a collective and individual history, a kind of afterlife. The dialogues that the Badarians conducted in their cemeteries, therefore, gave the entire community, the living and the dead together, a powerful and continuing resonance. Such acts are not explained as symbolism or offerings to the dead. Saturated with human care and contact, a visual and tactile intelligence was at work within these small communities, which is not easily reduced to sentences on a page. In the broader scheme of things, the activities of the Badarian burial parties mark a change from people thinking about the basic activities of farming and the transformation of natural processes, to thinking with some of the things that they themselves had made. Hindsight also shows that these graves stand at the beginning of a millennial process of funerary presentation and definition that would be undertaken by the people of the Nile with impressive dedication and extraordinary effect. Above all, the delectation of clear traditional design and high shining finishes such as the Badarians established in the finest of their ceramics remained a fundamental aesthetic element within ancient Egyptian culture down to the final dynasties of Pharaoh, part of the connection between community and craft, care and order. The living and the dead. 5. Black-topped, white-lined. Life in Upper Egypt, 4000 to 3500 BC. During her excavations at el-Badari, before she found a scattering of Badarian sherds lying on the surface of a buried desert, Caden Thompson's workmen had dug down through some 6 feet of prehistoric debris, the residue of later settlements on the same site. Unlike the Badarians, who at that time were an archaeological novelty, the culture of the people who had inhabited the later settlements was already known, vast cemeteries of their graves having been excavated a quarter of a century earlier by Flinders Petrie, who had invented his sequence dating system to order the enormous quantities of pottery that he had found. Although a thick deposit of limestone gravel had sealed off the Badarian strata from those immediately above, Caden Thompson saw that it was but the debris of a flash flood which had washed down into the valley from the desert plains above, and that the strata it divided had probably been close in time. There were, as well, strong cultural continuities, for the Badarian successors had lived in the same way as their predecessors. They had continued the same burial customs, and their potters had taken up and developed many of the Badarian techniques and forms. Petrie, presciently, had started his numbering system at sequence state 30, so the Badarians, whose pottery had shown comparatively little change, could be allotted 10 slots of their own, from 20 to 29, an estimation which the later carbon-14 dates would prove to be appropriate. Petrie always maintained that naming prehistoric cultures after the places where their relics were first found was cumbrous and inexact. Nonetheless, just as Brunton had named the Badarians after the local county town, so the 1,000 years of prehistory that Petrie had excavated and then sequenced with his numbered dating system now takes its name from the modern town of Naqada in Upper Egypt, close to the first prehistoric cemetery that he excavated. The name may easily mislead, because there are now hundreds of so-called Naqadan sites all up and down the Nile. At the same time, though, the label has also proved appropriate, for later excavations have shown that the heartlands of this millennial culture lay in modern Upper Egypt, to the south of el-Badari. So, nowadays this lively country town, with its clusters of minarets and church spires and a reputation for silk weaving and a fiery distillate of dates, lends its name to the better part of Egyptian prehistory, carbon-14 analysis having determined that the various phases of the so-called Naqadan culture flourished throughout the 4th millennium BC, whilst the pottery-making tradition that bears the same name only came to its ending centuries later, at the time of the building of the pyramids. Broadly speaking, the Naqadan culture is considered to have passed through 3 distinct phases, early, middle and late, a progress founded on the Division of the pottery sequences into three major phases labeled Naqada 1, 2, and 3, each one of which accounts for about a third of Petrie's original sequence numbers. Recent archaeology and the continuing statistical analysis of pottery, however, have enabled the subdivision and extension of these three stages into a dozen different subtypes which, in their turn, have been further subdivided to create such archaeological mnemonics for the identification of individual pots as belonging to the productions of, say, Naqada IC2 or Naqada Faiyum 2. Such typological sophistications may easily create the illusion that they represent 1,000 years of history. It is not so. Despite the labeling at excavations of successive strata by such archaeological designations, the account of Naqadan culture that it provides is more like miniature geology than a modern history. Both its major phases, 1, 2, 3, and those of some of the pottery subphases are counted out in centuries, and often there is little agreement as to which specific centuries they are. Change inside separate Naqadan settlements, moreover, also appears to have moved at different rates, and no two cemeteries contain the same range of grave goods. The culture, if one may call it that, is prehistoric. Reference to absolute time is always vague and hedged about with qualifying terms. Like geology, however, a clear order and pattern may be detected in those successive phases, Naqadan 1, 2 and 3, changes that, however vaguely they can be set into a modern time frame, tell a great deal about the ethos of the ancient society in which they were occurring. And so we may observe in general terms some of the motivations of the generations that created ancient Egypt. The graphic image. From the beginning, Naqadan potters drew elaborate images on some of their bowls and vases, thin, white-line drawings that are the oldest graphic arts in Egypt and stand at the beginning of the pharaonic tradition of illustration, hieroglyphics and design. This was the beginning, therefore, of the visual cultures that the modern world now identifies as ancient Egypt. Hardly any earlier potters had drawn on their wares. Occasionally, one of the Badarian craftsmen had scratched spidery shapes or geometric patterns into the surface of the clay, and sometimes they had burnished patterns on the bottom of their cooking pots, either in the shape of a Maltese cross or, more wistfully, perhaps, and hatched designs resembling vegetables or fish bones. Now, though, the early Naqadan potters divided their finer highly polished products between those which were given a traditional blaze of carbon black and left unpainted, and others, usually of different forms, that were covered with a rusty red ochre, washed and decorated, on occasion, with images and patterns, thickly painted in creamy, often rather tremulous and gritty lines straight onto the shining surfaces of simple ceramic forms. The designs impart a shimmering, gem-like quality to their pots. These drawings share the same imagery and are delineated with the same characterful outlines as the later ancient Egyptian craftsmen's fundamental repertoire: water, fish, man, boat, mountain, donkey, hippopotamus and so on. And in a manner which, like that of the pharaonic craftsman, communicates the identity and qualities of its subject directly and unambiguously. These earliest of drawings, though, do not appear to have been a spontaneous innovation. Both their sureness and their extraordinary uniformity shows that a lively graphic culture had already educated the potter's hands and eyes, and had, therefore, preceded its appearance on pots. Parallels might be drawn, perhaps, between some of these images and the rock drawings of the Saharan herders, though the latter are notoriously difficult to date and are not composed in the same careful patterns that the potters placed onto their bowls and dishes. More immediately, the Naqadan images also reflect the vigorous graphic outlines of a range of miniature sculptures that the Badarians had made in ivory and clay, and which they occasionally used to decorate their combs, spoons and jewelry, employing the same graphic techniques to describe anything they wished to represent. The Naqadan craftsmen simply extended the Badarians' limited range of subject matter, though the early Naqadans' images are nothing like those of Western academic art, which we pretend derives directly from life and nature, they yet contain, as if by alchemy, the very essence of the living creatures they portray. So precise, indeed, were the Naqadan craftsmen's observations that many of the plants and creatures which they drew and carved may be identified today by their Linnean names. The Naqadans, in fact, created a visual taxonomy of the world around them, a stocktaking of the creatures of the lower Nile that rose eventually to include 150 species. Many of these images had already been put off the repertoire of the early white line pottery painters, whilst others had been used in other, quite specific contexts. The solid outlines of the turtle, crocodile, and desert fox, for instance, had been employed along with various species of Nile fish as the shapes of hard stone pigment grinding palettes, whilst the livelier silhouettes of ostrich, high-horned gazelle and ibex crowned some of the ivory pins and combs that were worn as dainty decorations in the hair. On rare occasions, as if in acknowledgement of their true origins, the pottery painters drew images of combs in short, sharp lines upon their red wash pots, beneath those of the silhouetted animals. It is unlikely, though ultimately unknowable, that these archetypal images were intended for the purposes to which they are usually assigned, that is, as the signs and symbols of some unspoken primitive anthropology. Some things, though, are certain. Drawn in outline on the pots, carved on occasion in glowing ivories in the most intractable of desert stones, both the subjects of the images and the materials from which they were made were the focus of intense scrutiny. A kind of meditation upon the world in which they lived, upon the rocks and clays and teeming wildlife of the lower Nile. It is as if the craftsmen had sensed the contradiction between the measured, cultivated world which they were creating and the world of which they were no longer part, that natural world of animals and plants and minerals. Sometimes, too, the pottery painters made little worlds within the pots they painted, a bowl decorated, perhaps, with zigzag watery lines across its center and a ring of clay model hippopotami running around its rim. In such designs there is much that harks back to the Merimdan cooking pot that was found filled with a trove of little objects, the ivory hippopotamus and the rest. This is true, not only of their subject matter but also in the patterns in which the potters set their images, in which usually divide the pot's round forms in the manner of a cross or clock or the weaving of a rush basket, that is to say, into radiating sections from the center in divisions of 4, 8 and 12. These little worlds are miniature versions of the Nile Valley. Usually, fishes, hippopotami and crocodiles are drawn in the lower sections of the vessel along with zigzag lines of water, whilst up above them and separated by triangles and horizontal lines, are images of land animals and people. One especially remarkable beaker has a lively group of model women set all around its rim, facing inwards and with every face and feature individually seen and drawn. The little group appears to be washing fabric together, at the river's bank, part filled with water. Such vessels would have portrayed the Naqadan's Nile-side world with a striking miniature reality, the landscape of a snow globe in reverse. Other pots appeared to have been designed as a single element within this reimagined world, swaying a little out of true like living palm trees. Some tall cylindrical vases are decorated with fronds around their upper sections, and the roots drawn along their bases are set in zigzag water lines. And all of these designs are based on the ingredients of life and landscape in the valley of the lower Nile, on water, and the insistent linearity of the river and the cliffs. Unfortunately, there is no indication of what functions these fine pots may have originally performed. Certainly the images they hold were not considered as mere decorations, since the pigments that the painters used are friable and soft, and quite unsuitable for daily wear. Found both in settlement sites and cemeteries, they witness the beginning of a new phase of Nilotic prehistoric culture, one following the Faiyum farmers' absorption with the manipulation of the natural environment and the Badarians' elaborate arrangement of man-made objects within their cemeteries. For the early Naqadan potters had begun to manipulate images of both natural and man-made things and to place them one beside the other to create a pictorial equivalent of the world in which they lived, settling and herding. On her way down to the buried sand dune with its scattering of Badarian sherds, Caden Thompson had excavated and removed the walls of 9 Naqadan huts. Modest circles made of wattle and daub, they are rare examples of their age and show that some of the early Naqadans were building in a manner similar to those of the Badarians. Set on a gravel bank high above the floodline, the 9 little circles, which are too small for homesteads, may have served as temporary shelters or as fuel and grain stores. And that in turn suggests that these early Naqadans moved as lightly on the earth as had their predecessors, traveling with their herds and returning to their crops at